Um, all right, so tonight the presentation is on No Drama Discipline, which is actually a book, and I'll show it to you in just a second. If you can mute yourself, that would be helpful. Unless
Okay,
you
I'm
have a
sorry.
question. No, you're
I'm sorry.
fine. No worries at all. I know that you've sat in my presentations before, but just in case, I'm Jennifer Danford. I'm with KBC. I've been there since January of last year, so I do a lot of the training around the Topeka area. And I was looking for some ways to do presentations around behavior and de-escalation that weren't like just the regular things that you guys hear all the time or the ones they teach in MAPS. So I was doing some research, and that's what led me to this book with the title No Drama Discipline. And so I will talk about that in just a second, but that's kind of the reasoning behind this. So some of the objectives are going to be just to learn about how discipline can be used to teach children and youth how to make better decisions. It can actually build their brain if we do discipline the right way. Whereas like consequences and punishment can stop the behavior, but may not actually teach our kids how to do the right things and may not actually build their brain as we're doing it. Also understand how the brain affects behavior, and then reflect on some different and new interventions. I know we've been through this, but just briefly, trauma. So what is trauma? Trauma is an emotional response to an event. So it's not necessarily the event itself, but it's our response to that event. So if both of us were in a car accident, it could be like a minor inconvenience to you, but to me, it could be really traumatizing. So trauma, that's why trauma is not an event, it's how we respond to it. Harm and trauma can be physical or emotional, real or perceived. A lot of times we think there has to be physical harm, but if we think of someone being bullied or verbally abused, there's not any physical harm. And so that's how that kind of works, if we can think of it that way. And then obviously we know that trauma can happen from one event or multiple events over time. A lot of our kids have the multiple event kind of trauma where they've been abused in the same way or in different ways over time, like with neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, that kind of stuff. I like to give people an idea of what kind of kids we're working with or what foster care looks like. We get across the country about 4 million reports. That's just people who call in the hotline. And so out of those 4 million, 2.9 million kids actually received some sort of preventative care or services. So they were linked up with their community mental health center or whoever DCF or Children's Division Services are in their state, offered to come in and do some sort of services. So about 600,000 kids out of those calls actually came into the foster care system. And so those are the kids that we deal with. When they break it down, about 450,000 were neglected, 76%. The next highest percentage was physical abuse, followed by sexual abuse. I think honestly, the physical abuse and sexual abuse is probably higher. It's just, hello, welcome. We're just getting started here. So Apologize for my voice. I have allergies really bad, so it's just um, I'm just kind of pushing through here, and I am marking you off. Okay, so I think what's happening is that neglect is the easiest one to prove in the court. And so a lot of times that's the one that will get stuck with our kids in their treatment plan and their court documents. But I think more than 16% of our kids are probably physically abused, and more than 10% of our kids are sexually abused. So that's kind of a breakdown. And then we know that most of our kids the abuse is caused by a parent, which is why we work with parents for reintegration. So just kind of a snapshot of what that looks like. Since we're talking about behaviors in this presentation, I thought it might be good just to identify some of the common mental health disorders in foster care. And I think I'll have a training on this coming up in the next quarter that'll kind of just briefly talk about some of these, but you've probably heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, any sort of attachment disorders, reactive attachment disorder is a big one that we talk about a lot, anxiety, depression. Personality disorders are rare in kids, but they do sometimes diagnose those in teenagers. Social anxiety, we see a lot of oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, a lot of ADHD in kids. I'm doing a presentation on that next month. If you have any kids that fall in that category, there's a lot to learn with that. Separation anxiety, we have a lot of kids with eating disorders as well. So those can come with a lot of different behaviors. There's also some other reasons our kids act out and have behaviors. One of them is being placed in different homes. I know the ideal situation is that they come into care and they're placed in one home and they stay in that home until they either reintegrate or become adopted. But typically kids, that doesn't happen. I don't want to say typically, but often that does not happen. We either place for a small amount and then find a foster home, or they move around a little bit. So every time our kids move around, they have to adjust to a new family system, and that takes a lot of emotional energy and brain energy. And so that can typically regress their development up to 6 months. So that can be like emotional development, social development, academic development. It can be any kind of development. So if you have a kid who's moved like 4 times in the last 2 years, you're looking at a child who has a significant amount of catching up to do. And then you're trying to help them catch up, and you're going to see some behaviors from them because they're behind everybody else. The next thing is that when these kids are moving around, even if it's just once or twice, it's disrupting their attachment, which they've already had disrupted, right? And so hypervigilance is going to happen where they're just in survival mode. And so when hypervigilance happens, this can look like noncompliance, defiance, and an inability to bond with the foster parent. And so we see these as misbehaviors. And so then we feel like we have to address these. So how do we do this? It's difficult. There's lots of different ways that people want to address discipline in foster care. I think we have a lot of good trainings. I looked into some different things and I found this book. It's up on the slide. It's called No Drama Discipline. It has a book that kind of goes with it called The Whole Brain Child, if you're interested in that as well. But this book specifically goes through different scenarios and different thoughts about how we can discipline our kids and see some results and build their brains. So I'm going to kind of just go through this book, I'm not gonna be able to go through like every bit of it. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to like check it out at your library, buy it, or listen to it to get the parts I missed. But I'm gonna go through like the main points, and if it's something you're interested in, that would be a good thing to do. So it's written by Daniel Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. Daniel Siegel is well known for his brain research, and I think I have a video of him explaining a little bit about some of this book as we move forward. So some of the main point of this book is that we can discipline in respectful ways that are nurturing, but that also maintain like super clear boundaries and consistent boundaries. So what we want to do is discipline and think about how we can be have a really good relationship, have high relationship, high respect, and then lower that drama and conflict, which is what we want to do. It obviously sounds easier than it is. And then in this process, we want to foster development that builds good relationship skills and improves our children's ability. So improves their capability to start making better decisions, thinking about others, and act in ways that prepare them for lifelong success and happiness. So at some point, we're going to be able to kind of pull back a little bit because we've taught them to kind of make some better decisions, which is what discipline should do. Whoa. Sorry about that. I pushed the wrong button. There we go. Okay, so effective discipline obviously teaches our kids cooperation and how to do the right thing, right? Like when we're disciplining or consequencing our kids, it's because they're not cooperating or they're not doing the right thing. So effective discipline is going to teach our kids how to do that. If you haven't been in math classes for a while, I teach those pretty consistently, and they talk about that interaction cycle. One of the things they talk about is when we have a child and we see a behavior, they talk about social control, which is essentially we stop the behavior, but we don't meet the need for the behavior. So something like a pacifier, right? Our child has a need for food or something, and we're pacifying them. And instead, we need to find out the need. So this is kind of that. We are, instead of just stopping the behavior, we are going to enable them with skills to be able to lessen the behaviors further down the road. So this instructs our kids in ways that develops skills and the capacity to resiliently handle challenging situations, frustrations, and emotional storms that may make them lose control. That sounds like a lot of foster kids to me, kids that have a lot of that stuff going on. Okay, so this book has several different chapters that kind of focus on different things, but the first part talks about some discipline questions that you can kind of slow down and ask when you are beginning to discipline a child. The questions are why, what, and how. So, why did my child act this way? And so when our child acts out, we can kind of approach with curiosity instead of assumptions. Again, that's kind of looking at the need instead of the behavior itself. Look at deeper to see what's going on, maybe assess whether that behavior was developmentally appropriate. Sometimes we all get stuck in this rut and like our kids do this thing and we respond this way, and then they do the thing, we respond this way, and it just continues and nothing changes. So kind of stepping back a little bit. What lesson do I want to teach in this moment? Remember that the actual goal of discipline isn't about consequences. Um, there is consequences in discipline, but that's not the end all and be all goal. Um, we want to teach a lesson, whether that's, we always do want to teach a lesson, whether that's self-control, the importance of sharing, acting responsibly, any of those things. But we're not going to always teach that if we just go straight to the consequence. So thinking about that. And then how can I best teach this lesson? We have to have some considerations here, the child's age, and their developmental stage, kind of the context, taking everyone's emotional state into the consideration. And we'll talk about that in here in just a second. And then using some collaborative problem solving. So one thing to remember, and you guys probably know this well, but what works for one child may not work for their sibling or any other child in the home. And the same thing goes for like what works for them 1 minute may not work for them 10 minutes later or later that evening. So trying to figure out discipline can be really, really hard. So we need to remember how important it is to discipline this one child in this one moment. So learning how to make those decisions. There's a small aside in the book about can't versus won't, and I did want to bring that up because I think it's something we don't think of sometimes. Sometimes we assume our kids won't behave when they just can't. Like an example is, you know, a young child, 1 or 2 years old in the grocery store, and we have them in the grocery cart for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and they, towards the end, get really fussy and start picking up things and throwing things. Um, should we assume that that child is purposefully acting out, or are they just too young to sit that long in that grocery cart while you are shopping? So we need to start kind of thinking like, are they just unable to behave under these circumstances, and how can we address that? Sometimes our kids just absolutely can't, and that's where diagnoses come in too. It's not an excuse. We have to kind of figure out what works and prevent some of those situations. But it is important if we're disciplining a child over and over and over for something that they can't change. Okay, so having a discipline philosophy. A lot of people have like an overarching idea of what that might be like. You know, like we're structured here and we expect that people in our home will have consequences when they don't follow the rules or something like that, which is fine. That's kind of how I roll too. But they say in this book to maybe be more specific. And I have in the references some things, websites, I think, where you can kind of actually print some of this stuff out without getting the book. But so they ask several questions, and that's the first one. Do I have a discipline philosophy? How purposeful and consistent am I when I don't like how my kids are behaving? So what is that overall? Is what I'm doing working? So does my approach allow me to teach my kids the lessons I want to teach in terms of both like immediate behavior and also in terms of how they grow and develop as human beings? So am I finding over time that these behaviors are becoming less and less, or am I disciplining the same behaviors over and over? Because if those things are happening, then what you're doing isn't working. So something's got to change. So looking at that can be helpful. I mean, you could just have a really hard kid, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking for something else. So do I feel good about what I'm doing? I mean, nobody likes disciplining, but after the fact, does your discipline approach help you enjoy your relationship with your kids more? If you are like reflecting on your discipline later, do you feel okay or good about how you handled yourself? Or do you, wonder if there's a different way? How do your kids feel about it? Again, not going to be popular, discipline isn't, but do they, if they're old enough, do they understand what your intent is behind it? And do they still feel that relationship between you two? Is that still there? Um, do I feel good about the messages I'm communicating to my children? Okay, so when you discipline, there are inherent messages behind what you're doing. So, um, sometimes when you're disciplining, you're saying, um, what you say is more important than learning to make good decisions about doing the right thing. Or maybe you're teaching that power and control are the best ways to get people to do what we want. Or if we send people away every time they have a tantrum, we might be teaching that it's only good to have people around who are pleasant. So these aren't purposeful messages, but kids make up stories if they don't know what the purpose is. And those could be some of the stories they make up. Thinking about how your approach resembles that of your parents. And that's just a good question because you know how your parents' approach sat with you. And so if it was an approach that really you feel like harmed you and you're doing the same thing, then we're kind of on the wrong road here. But if it was really a helpful approach and you're doing the same thing, then you're in a good place. So just kind of understanding where you come from with that. And then a really good question is, does your approach ever lead to your kids apologizing in a sincere manner? I think it's a good question because good discipline teaches empathy, and we'll talk about that later. And I think if we're seeing that, then we're seeing that we're kind of going in the right direction. The final question is, does your approach and discipline allow you to take responsibility and apologize for your own actions? So how open are you with kids when you do make a mistake? And are you willing to model when you do mess up? Because that is a good model for them. If they only see people in their lives who are perfect and or when they mess up become very defensive, that's not going to be helpful for them in terms of building their brain. Okay, so the next part here is they talk about 3 C's when it comes to the brain. The brain is changing. The brain is complex. And the next one will be a surprise to us. So the brain is changing. This is really good stuff because it helps us understand how our kids' brains are wired and how we can utilize this to better help them grow. So they simplify this into what's called the downstairs brain versus the upstairs brain. I'm sure you guys have heard of like your frontal lobe or your brain stem, and they have 2 different purposes. So our downstairs brain is the brain stem and the limbic region. So it's more primitive. These are just survival actions, strong emotions, instincts, basic functions like breathing, sleeping, digestion are all in these parts of the brain. I think I'm going to show a video that helps us with this. Our upstairs brain is responsible for complex thinking and being logical. This is where we want to kind of talk to our kids about things. It is underdeveloped at birth. It grows throughout childhood. Again, it's responsible for decision-making, planning, regulation of emotions, personal insight, flexibility, empathy, morality, all the things that we really want our kids to have. It doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s. So we're still, that's why our teenagers are still struggling, even though they know these things. They may do great one day, the next day you're like, what happened to your brain? But here's the thing, our upstairs brain doesn't just automatically grow. We have to teach it. And so we can help develop this throughout disciplining. So sometimes we need to temporarily act as an upstairs brain until our kids can practice the skill. And that happens with, and I'll talk about some of this later, us helping them solve issues discipline wise out loud until they can do it themselves. This is even things like us helping them craft an apology and then walking with them to the person until they say they're sorry or things like that. This stuff helps them build their upstairs brain. So here's a quick video on how that works.
Your brain is powerful and strong. It helps you remember that 2 + 2 = 4, makes you blink and breathe without even thinking, and even helps you play your favorite video games. But it's so much more than that too. Your brain has 3 main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. It also has 2 sides, a left and a right, 4 lobes, the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And then each of these lobes can be broken down even more into areas that have specific jobs. Yowza, that's a lot of pieces. Let's see if we can make it a bit easier to understand. You can think of your brain kind of like a 2-story house. In this house, there's an upstairs and a downstairs. The upstairs and downstairs brains both have very important jobs. Your downstairs brain's job is to keep you safe. It is responsible for things like breathing, super strong emotions like anger and fear, and watching out for danger. The upstairs brain's job is to help you think. Yep, that's right. Its job is to help you problem solve, learn, and make good decisions. A house wouldn't be a home without people inside, right? Your brain has some characters in it that play a really important role in what you're thinking, feeling, and doing. Let's talk about the characters in the downstairs brain first. Down here, you have alerting Annie. She lets us know if there's danger nearby. Angry Albert, he responds really quickly with, you guessed it, anger. And frightened Fred, he's pretty much scared of everything, but it's because he wants to keep us safe. Then there's the boss. This is Big Boss Bob. His job is to take information from Albert, Annie, and Fred and react. There is no thinking involved. He just listens to them, and if they say danger is nearby, he acts super fast. Bob does this in 3 different ways: fight, flight, or freeze. Your upstairs brain has some characters in it too. Up here, you have problem-solving Patty. She helps recognize problems and come up with solutions. Calming Carl, his job is to help us calm down when we're upset. Flexible Felix, he allows us to go with the flow. And focusing Frank, he allows us to pay attention and learn. All of these characters don't act super fast. It takes time for them to stop and think before doing anything. Any house with an upstairs and downstairs has a staircase that connects them, right? So does your brain house. We need both the upstairs and downstairs brains to work together. When the brain's staircase is built and strong, our characters can move up and down the staircase to share information. This allows the upstairs brain to try and make sense of strong emotions from Albert, Annie, and Fred, and try to figure out how to help. But it's not always that easy. You see, even though your downstairs brain is done being built when you're born, your upstairs brain is under construction until you are in your mid-20s, which means your staircase can be kind of fragile as a kid. And Bob is kind of bossy. So when he thinks that danger is around, he may flip a switch to break your staircase in order to keep you safe, even when there's no actual danger around. Let's look at it this way. Let's pretend that you are out at recess. The sun is shining, it's nice and warm out, and you're playing with your friends. All of a sudden, a cute little kitten wanders on the playground. Annie, Fred, and Albert are going to say, "Aw, look at that cute kitten." Bob will send a message upstairs to say, "Everyone, look, it's a cute little kitten." Bob doesn't sense any danger, so problem-solving Patty is able to stop and think about what to do next. Patty decides that you should probably go and tell the teacher that the kitten is on the playground. Maybe it's lost and your teacher can help get it home. Awesome. The upstairs and downstairs brain worked together to solve the problem. Now, let's take the same day at recess, but add something different. Instead of a kitten that shows up, a giant T-Rex stomps onto the scene. Annie immediately goes over to Bob and says, Bob, we have a problem. Fred does the same thing, saying, there's a dinosaur on the playground. Bob has no time to go upstairs so Patty can figure out what to do. Instead, he flips the switch to break the staircase and responds super fast by having you run away, flight, and hide, freeze inside of the school. So clearly Bob is really good at acting fast to keep us safe. Unfortunately, your brain, and Bob in particular, cannot tell the difference between a hard question on a math test and a dinosaur on the playground, especially when Bob flips his switch to break the staircase. But guess what? You can make your staircase stronger by practicing calming strategies like deep breathing and learning how to relax your muscles. The more you practice these when you feel good, the more likely Bob is to respond to them when your feelings get too big. Trusted adults can also act as carpenters for your broken staircase, rebuilding each step to help Bob reach Patty and solve the problem together. Teachers and parents, for more information about the upstairs and
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about building that staircase, but if our kids are responding immediately without thinking, sometimes our instinct is to try to have a logical conversation with them at that time and say, slow down, stop. We've talked about this before. You need to respond in this way, but their staircase is broken. They cannot use the upper part of their brain, and we're going to get nowhere with them. And so that's why I think that video is helpful to understand that once they're in that lower part of that brain, there's nothing we can do logically with them. We have to soothe them, get them out of that place, and then come back and have that conversation. This is a super quick video because it's really hard for me to explain about the second C, which is the brain is changeable, which really talks about how like our neuroplasticity in our brain, and how if we have habits, or our kids come in and things are certain ways, we can still change those. I think this is only 2 minutes long.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic, hence neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep traveling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, You have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
Okay, so our last C is our brain is complex. Okay, so we talked about different parts of the brain, and the book goes into this. I'm just giving kind of an overview. You know, the upstairs, the downstairs, and so we can appeal to the different parts of the brain when we see our child acting from those parts. If we can learn to see what kind of behavior is happening. And so we can be more effective. If we're trying to be logical when our child is in their brainstem, that is not effective. And a lot of parents do that. So that's one part. He talks about poking the lizard. This is essentially when our child is in this brainstem, the downstairs part of the brain, and we discipline in a way that seems to the child like we're threatening them. Even though I know as foster parents, you wouldn't purposefully threaten a child. Again, our child is always looking for like the hypervigilance for the possible threat. So they're looking for something scary like our tone, our nonverbals, our posture, our facial expressions. And once we activate those defensive circuits, that's what they call poking the lizard in the book. And it almost always leads to escalating emotions for the child. And then because of that, for the parent. And so then it just kind of goes in this thing. So learning what that threshold is for your child and how you can kind of prevent that. This is kind of cool, this setting limits thing. Turns out, sorry, it turns out setting limits actually trains our brain. It actually grows our brain. So we have a couple parts of our brain. I'm going to do my best here. It's our whole nervous system. We have the sympathetic branch, which is more of the accelerator of the system. So more of the energy part of the system, and then the parasympathetic branch, which is our calming down part of our system, which that is kind of like our brakes. And so learning how to push on the accelerator and step on the brakes is a life skill. And a lot of times when kids don't have limits, this can be a huge issue in adulthood. We see these kind of kids, whether it's by neglect or just parents who struggle with limits. Maybe they don't know when to stop playing video games when they're adults, or they spend all their money, or things like this. I mean, these problems can happen when you do have limits, but their brains aren't trained for that. So if we have a child's inappropriate or impulsive action, that's their accelerator. Our parental limit setting is the application of the brakes, and that helps them feel what it feels like to have limits set and feel comfortable with that. And that actually grows their brain so that they can start setting limits later. And so that's something we need to do. We'll talk about yes with a condition later, what that looks like. But essentially, this is a way that we can say no to kids, but say yes with a condition. An example would be, can I play one more video game tonight? Or can I keep playing video games? Yes, you can play one more tomorrow after school, instead of saying, no, we're done for tonight. Hearing the word no can be a big thing for our kids. When limit setting and no are accompanied by a lot of anger or comments that are angry towards a child, sometimes that learning to curb the behavior turns into a complicated like shame process. Like an example would be setting limits around food for a child with food insecurity, and not being careful about that. That doesn't help them set limits. That helps, or that promotes some shame and things like that. So we just had to be careful. Okay, the third, no, we already talked about the 3 C's. The next thing we talk about is connection. It's super important to have a connection with our kids as we go into discipline. This is Dan Siegel. He's the one who wrote the book. An older video, but this is a really good example of some things that go into connection.
There are studies that everybody should know about that I summarize with the phrase, name it to tame it. So if you're really agitated, you're frightened of being rejected again, or you're really upset with what happened, or you're angry or whatever, in Maria's right brain, I can tell you this, in addition to right and left, there's, now please excuse these incredibly simplistic statements, but there's an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. Now, I'm fine with that for this parenting book, but believe me, my son, my other foot is in science, and the scientists would see that and go, what? But the fact is, there's a cortical rim where a lot of this higher stuff goes on, and there's everything below the cortex. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your fingers and put your hands over the top, give this a try. This would be in my brain like this, see? And so this would be the cortex where you do all your thinking and planning and all that kind of stuff. If you lift up your cortex, you have everything below the cortex, which we call the downstairs brain. So that's reasonable. Downstairs is just a substitute for the word subcortical, which freaks parents out. So downstairs. And it's the upstairs brain is the cortex. Okay, so you lift up your upstairs brain, you go to your downstairs brain, that's the subcortex. It's the limbic area and it's the brainstem. These are very ancient circuits responsible for things like emotion and motivation and fight, flight, freeze reaction and your arousal states, whether you're awake or asleep, stuff like that. So what happens at that moment is, if we did a scan on your brain, we would say that your right amygdala, your limbic area, and your downstairs brain, the downstairs brain was super active. Scared, I'm scared, I'm scared, I'm scared, I'm scared, I'm scared. And studies show that if you have this kind of presence and of mind, I can get Maria's left brain to name feeling from the downstairs brain. And you can show that she will squirt soothing neurotransmitters down to her right limbic area, right downstairs brain, and calm it down. Okay, so we quickly summarize that entire set of studies with name it to tame it. And so that's all parents need to know. The book, we didn't put any of this stuff, but everything is backed up by science, believe me.
So what does that look like? I come to you and I have a problem. What do you?
So here's what it looks like. So let's say you're agitated about being rejected by your friends. So I give you the hug. All I'm doing at that moment, I'm not naming anything. You don't jump to that. First, it's connect and then redirect. So that's, we have these strategies, connect and redirect. So the idea is, first I connect with my right hemisphere. That helps soothe your whole system, but you're still nervous about going back to school. So then I say, well, let's talk about it. And you say, well, this happened, and she was there, and she was going to go to the party, but she didn't want to go, and then they turned away from me. They wouldn't have lunch with me. And I said, sounds like you're really feeling big feeling of fear that when you go to school tomorrow, no one's going to want to have lunch with you. So we're naming fear.
And I thought I was angry.
And maybe you were angry too.
But it helps to have the.
Right, but you have to actually name the accurate emotion.
I hear that.
Right? Because we could say, well, you're feeling excited to go for popsicles,
Yeah.
but that's wrong.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not just
Yeah.
naming anything.
And when you name it, it registers as true. That's what I'm getting at, is sometimes we think we're angry, but in fact, we're sad or we're
Right.
fearful.
So,
So
yeah.
by you saying fear, it might in fact.
That would calm your downstairs brain.
Yeah.
Right. So that at that moment, then we're using first connecting with the right hemisphere, helps the system get stabilized. You don't feel alone. The next step is to name it to tame it. So I'm going to now help you with my left brain, because I'm going to use both my hemispheres together and go, gosh, I wonder what my daughter's really feeling here. And I'm not going to tell you what you're feeling, but I would say something like, I wonder if you're feeling scared. And then in Maria's brain, the whole system calms down.
Okay, yeah, so connection is important. There's just a slide that they talk about in the book a little bit, that we can avoid discipline sometimes if we're preventative instead of reactive. When our child acts out, asking ourselves if they're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, things we can kind of address, especially like hungry or tired, just being able to address those things. How much sleep do kids need, kind of knowing this, but the truth is, especially with foster care, these kids may need a different amount of sleep based on their trauma and the medications they're on. So just making sure our kids get the sleep that they need. Okay, so connection is really important. He talked about that a little bit. Again, he talked about like when our kids are angry or upset, maybe not being willing to jump into that with them right away. Like when we're angry or upset, having someone tell us, calm down, don't be angry or upset is not always the most helpful. So trying to lean on that connection instead. Through connection, we can soothe their internal storms, help them calm down, and assist them in making better decisions. So he has this in the book, this river of, what does he call it? I don't remember what it doesn't say. River of well-being. That's it. Okay. So it's this river of well-being. And our kids, when they act up, they aren't in the middle of the river anymore. They go to one of the shores. We almost always see chaos, emotions everywhere, or rigidity, which is like the inability to step away from something. Like, but we always do this on Tuesdays, and you're like, well, this Tuesday we cannot do it. So, but we always do it. Like they just cannot get away from this whatever rigidity. So, he talks about how this is how kids are, and what connection can do is help them get back into the center of this well-being. If we can help them name their feelings, if we can, we'll talk more about things we can do with connection. So it moves a child from reactivity to receptivity. So like they aren't so reactive, but then they're able to kind of hear what you have to say. Connection builds the brain because it improves their capacity for more relationships. We know if a child could connect with one adult, they're more likely to be able to connect with other adults. Self-control, empathy, personal insight, and more. And then it also helps build that staircase between downstairs and upstairs. So discipline is about teaching. Teaching requires our kids to be receptive to learning. And receptivity comes from connection. So connection, therefore, moves our kids from reactivity to receptivity. Oh, and then one of the most important things, it deepens the relationship with your child, and showing our connection during discipline helps us communicate how much we value the relationship. Like, this is a moment where you've done something wrong, but I'm still connected to you. I still care enough about you that we're going to sit here and solve this together. So that can show a lot to a child. So here's a connection cycle they have in the book. Just kidding. I think that's on the next slide. So communicate comfort. Most nurturing actually takes place non-verbally, whether that's like a smile, a look across the room. Our kids are always looking for affirmations, so those kind of things. Any sort of touch releases oxytocin, which is, our feel-good hormone, into our brain, and it actually decreases that cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So that's even like just a touch on the shoulder or touch on the arm, but it could even be a hug. And so those things, if they happen consistently throughout the day or consistently throughout the week, can really put a lot into the bank of connection with our kids. And then always just knowing that our kids are looking for threats. So putting our body in a posture that's the opposite of threatening, even in everyday conversation. We need a lot of validation for our kids. So we all can agree that we don't like the behaviors that our kids do when they have these big feelings. But one of the biggest tasks as parents is to help them separate the feeling from the behavior. And then maybe acknowledging those feelings. So that is a huge discipline task. You tore up all your brother's homework. Not acceptable. But let's talk about what's going on here. What feeling are you having? You're mad. Feeling mad is okay. Feeling angry is okay. The behavior is not, but getting them to understand those things can take a while. So practically speaking, validation means resisting the temptation to deny or minimize what our kids are going through. Okay, you're feeling mad because your sock didn't fit good. Okay, that's a silly reason to feel mad. We're not feeling mad about that. Okay, let them feel mad about that. Again, the behavior is the part that's not okay. So this is the connection cycle. This is where we have to stand back and listen. Our kid gets in trouble at school for something pretty not okay. I don't know, getting into a fight. So our response is typically they get in the car and boom, we're like, what were you thinking? I had to pick you up. Okay. This connection cycle wants us to stop talking and listen. You know, we tend to explain something and then make the same point over and over. Fighting at school is not acceptable. What happened? I can't believe you did this because you know, fighting at home isn't okay. So we do the same thing. We know that talking to an emotionally activated child is not effective. Child just sat in the office for an hour waiting for you to pick them up. They're scared. They're tired. So listen. Maybe just say, this is not like you, what's going on? And then listen to what they say. The goal is to make sure that the child comprehends, you understand their experience. The child says, I don't know, I was, one of my friends, I heard them get called a name and I just got so mad I hit someone. Okay, I hear that you were upset that your friend was called a name and you hit someone. Okay, you're reflecting it. You're communicating that you're actually hearing them. You're not just listening to listen. So the connection cycle. We communicate comfort through the touch, we validate, we listen, we reflect. Then we can start doing some disciplining because when we've done that connection cycle, we have started to move them out of their downstairs brain into their upstairs brain, where then we can say, okay, I bet you felt mad. That would make me feel mad. Okay, fighting though. That's not a behavior we have. So here, what are we going to do about it? What kind of consequences are we going to have here? Okay. So they have a thing in the book called 1, 2, 3 discipline. There's one definition. Discipline is teaching. There are 2 principles. Wait until your child is ready. We talked about that a little bit. We don't want to hit them with discipline when they're in a downstairs brain. The second principle is be consistent but not rigid. So our kids need consistency. They need predictable, attuned, sensitive care, but they need to know that you can change things around if it's necessary. That maybe not every time they get in trouble at school, there's a consequence because sometimes things just happen or sometimes rules can be broken, things like that. To always be rigid can be kind of overwhelming to a child. And then 3 mindsight outcomes. What is mindsight? Mindsight in this book is ability to see our own mind as well as the mind of another. So mindsight is insight, which our kids lack. pretty horribly. Most kids do, but kids in care with trauma do, even more probably. And then empathy is seeing the mind of another. Again, a lot of kids lack empathy in their early years. We have to learn empathy. It's not something we're born with, but our kids in care sometimes struggle with empathy as well. And then putting these together, integration and the repair of ruptures. So this is where we're working with our kids to help them understand what's happening in their own brain. What am I feeling? What is this behavior? And then we're also helping them to see how their actions impact other people. And then we're working with them on how to make things okay when they have hurt other people. Questions that go with MindSight outcomes and integration are, what can you do to make this right? What do you think needs to happen now? So sometimes when our kids are little, or depending on their temperament, an apology needs to be made. The caregiver might have to make an apology for the child, like in front of the child, but still have a conversation with the child ahead of that and agree on the principle of the apology. Making ruptures right by apologizing, reparation, those kind of things is really important in teaching this integration and also empathy. So it builds the brain and gives it experience in that area. Empathy is not something that we are born with. It's something we learn. Okay, so this is the last part of the book. It's called Redirect. It's an acronym, an acrostic. I can't remember which one it's called. I think an acrostic. So that each letter stands for something so you can remember it. There's like on their website, I think you can print out a thing of this too. So we'll just talk about each one. So for some of them, I took pictures of some things in the book, so they're on there. So reduce words. So when our kids act out, we want to address the issue, but keep it succinct. Here's the deal, even with young kids for sure, but even with our older kids, long lectures overflood them with sensory info. And so they start tuning out. This comic is kind of hard to see, but it's basically a parent or a dad explaining to a child how he has to be responsible with his schoolwork. And he's saying all the reasons why. And all the kid hears is good habits, blah, 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 blah. Like he's already somewhere else in his head. So is that effective discipline? I mean, not really, because the kid's kind of over it and he's not really hearing the points anyway. So it'd be more effective to say, you need to do your homework. What do you think we need to do here? Do our homework. Okay. Why? Because we got to get, quick conversation. Embrace emotions. So one of the best ways to address behavior is to help kids distinguish, again, between their feelings and their actions. So feelings and behaviors are not the same thing. So using redirections, we can help them understand their feelings aren't good or bad. They're just a part of who we are. So even when our kids are young, I think they make a lot more toys now that show emotions. You can like flip faces, those kind of things, but just teaching kids to identify emotions is a really helpful thing for this. And this statement here, you can feel whatever you feel, but you can't always do whatever you want to do. I mean, it's just something that we constantly need to teach our kids is you can have those big feelings, especially in foster care. You can have a lot of big feelings. That's totally okay. But the behaviors that go with the feelings are going to have consequences or they're not okay. So describe, don't preach. This can be really hard because we just want so much for our kids, but our tendency is to criticize and preach when our kids do something we don't like. So, I don't know, take something from someone else or don't do their chores. But instead, we can just describe what we're seeing. So, hey, Tommy, The last couple nights, I've been seeing you do clearing the table less and less. That still could start a fight, but you're not saying, you're not doing your chores. So see what happens when that happens, instead of just saying, you know what, you're not doing your chores after dinner. This happened a couple months ago, remember? We got into this deep funk where you weren't doing anything. We had to take away your Nintendo, like all that. Just describe it, see where it goes. A lot of times kids don't need parents to tell them not to make bad decisions. They know they've made it after they made it. I will say a lot of our kids are impulsive, so sometimes they make bad decisions without thinking, but once they've made it, they typically know. They don't need us to say you made a bad decision. They know. They need for us to redirect them. That's what they need. They need us to help them recognize the bad decisions, recognize what leads up to those decisions, especially if they're impulsive, and then they need us to help enable them to correct themselves. The I stands for involve your child in the discipline. So typically, pretty much until parenting just recently, it's been like the parent tells the child, this is what happens when you mess up. But it turns out that it can be more respectful and effective, discipline can, if we initiate a more collaborative approach. If we sit down with our kid and say, I've got some ideas here about what I think should happen because of that fight you got in at school. But I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are. Like, what do you think should happen? And kind of having a dialogue. That can be helpful. And let them know that you are connected to them and that you're willing to problem solve with them. It also helps them grow their brain. We talked about this a bit earlier, reframe a no into a yes. Some of our kids are really, really adverse to the word no. And sometimes it can just send our kids back to that reactive state in a child, which can take in the fight, flight, or freeze. So like this example is this child staying at grandma's. Can I stay at grandma's? And he says, of course you can have more time with Nana. How about this weekend? Instead of saying like, no, we're leaving now. I mean, kids are smart enough to see through what you're saying, but they also then say, well, am I going to fight about it? Because now I've got promised more time, do I have to turn off the Xbox? Well, you can have Xbox time tomorrow. I don't know. Could work, could not work. I think it works more with younger kids. Can I get one more story? Yes, you can have one more story tomorrow in the morning. Things like that. Older kids probably see through it pretty quick. Again, emphasizing the positive. This can be seen a couple of different ways. First of all, catch your kids when they're doing well. We definitely want to call them out. Say, hey, you have been clearing the table every night for the last 2 weeks. I'm really impressed. No one's even said anything to you about it, and you're really doing a good job. That's good for our kids. The other thing is flipping a negative command to a positive. So we have kids who like baby talk or whine, and we're just constantly saying, stop using your baby voice or stop whining. And if you can flip it and say, can you use your big boy voice when you talk to me? Or this one's about whining. It says, ask me in your powerful big boy voice. That way I can actually, listen. That can be helpful. Because otherwise they just hear the stop, 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 and that kind of turns their brain off. Okay, so creatively approaching the situation. In foster care, definitely you have to be flexible, think on your feet. A lot of times humor can diffuse a situation as well. It just depends on each child's temperament, but you have the gift of being able to say a joke at the right time, and can diffuse a situation before it gets too out of hand, then use that by all means. That can also be something that allows connection. Some people just have that ability. And then also just looking for different ways to creatively approach situations that are typically struggling situations, like maybe situations around visits or situations around transitions, times that are hard, trying to find ways to be flexible about those times, make them a little less overwhelming. And the last one is teach those mindset skills, where we're trying to teach the insight and empathy and connect those. So again, we need to let our kids and teens know that they don't have to get stuck in those negative experiences. They don't have to be a victim to outside events or internal emotions, that they have control. They can use their mind to take charge of how they feel and how they act, giving them that control back. We can help our kids increasingly have a say in how they feel and look at the world. And so this is really powerful. This is, you know, a lesson we want to teach our kids as they go through the foster care journey. But I think we have to get through a lot of those other things before they get here. I think the mindset stuff is some of the most powerful stuff in the book. Just briefly, because I know discipline can be hard and foster parenting can be hard. Compassion fatigue, wanted to talk to you about that. Again, a lot of our parents get compassion fatigue. Almost everyone in this field does at some point. So just wanted to make you guys aware of that. It's just when you guys get overwhelmed, it causes emotional distress and exhaustion. So secondary trauma, which is essentially feeling the trauma that our kids feel by hearing their cases or knowing what they are going through, actually can give you PTSD symptoms. Plus burnout, which is just the overall day-to-day stuff that just has you feeling maybe some sort of mental exhaustion, can make you physically exhausted, can have you just overwhelmed at the whole child welfare system. All that together equals compassion fatigue. So I kind of talked about compassion fatigue, burnout, and the secondary trauma. There is compassion satisfaction. That's why you guys are foster parents. So we have to try to find ways to keep you there, recognizing what the positive aspects are. I already talked about burnout, but that's really the first. Burnout's kind of the first sign that things are struggling. Some of the symptoms, like nothing you can do will help. You get tired, exhausted, feeling like you're failing, like you can't do your job well, frustrated, cynical, maybe disconnected from others, lacking feelings, depressed, like you need to use more alcohol to cope. So I'm going to play this last video and then we'll be done. I just like this video because with behaviors and burnout, sometimes we get disconnected from our kids, our bio kids and our foster kids, and it makes it really hard for us to start implementing these strategies. Like, we feel like we don't want to be maybe around them, we don't want to discipline them, we just need like a huge break from them. So this is what's called blocked care. She's going to just talk briefly about this.
Hi, good morning. My name's Nikki. Welcome to today's Coffee with Chosen. If you are parenting a child that's gone through trauma, you have likely experienced a time where you feel like you have literally given all of your physical and emotional resources and depleted them in trying to care for the unique needs of your child. Have you ever had a time where you even felt like you genuinely want to have more compassion and connection and caring for your child, but you feel like you just can't, or that something is even blocking you from being able to do so? Dan Hughes, the creator of DDP, Dyadic Developmental Psychotherapy, actually has a term for this, and he calls it blocked care. What happens is, as caregivers, we have these hormones and chemicals that are released in our bodies, and they prime us for caregiving. They're kind of responsible, you can think, for those warm and fuzzy connecting feelings that we have with people. You can also think of them as kind of giving, receiving chemicals, that they're replenished whenever we give something that feels good, and then when we're getting it back from that other person in return, building it up. Parents who have been under a lot of stress, or if you have a child that has a difficult time trusting or building attachments and relationships, often have these very depleted and not built up. And that imbalance can really cause you to feel a physical disconnect or feelings with your child. So how do we work on unblocking blocked care? The first thing would be to practice self-care. So the more that we can manage our own emotions, our own stress, the more capacity we will automatically be able to have for another person and their needs, and have empathy for them, which can help grow the bond. Another thing you can do is practice just even 10 minutes a day of one-on-one time with your child, doing something that you both enjoy. So even just little positive experiences that you can put in here can help build this up. My advice for one-on-one time would be this: make sure that you as the parent are in a good headspace to be able to do that. If I'm about to do it, sometimes I will take a jog just around my block real quick, so that I can just kind of be feeling calm and not too stressed out, so that I can be in a good space to be present with my child and have patience if I need. If you are experiencing blocked care with your child.
Okay. So here's some references, and then I will